All right, guys, after my last video where I talked about a trade rumor of Rudy Gobert to the Charlotte Hornets, where theoretically the Jazz would be getting Gordon Hayward back, I got a lot of comments about people talking about things like the Jazz get immediately worse. Why would you do this? I think it's important we talk about this because I think there's some things the Jazz have to be thinking about right now for the future of the team if they want to actually have a chance to make it to the championship. Let's talk about it. It's the Hoops Nerds Show. All right, guys, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that trade. In that trade we talked about, there was a possibility of the Jazz getting 2 draft picks back and Gordon Hayward. And what would they be giving? Rudy Gobert. Now, does anyone think that is a reasonable person that Rudy Gobert is not a better, more impactful player than Gordon Hayward? Nobody. Nobody thinks that. If you think that, then you should be getting another hobby. The reason the Jazz should think about doing something like that, and that's why they should think about a lot of different moves like that, is if they want to win a title. Now, obviously, they get worse in that trade. How does that make them win a title? Well, next year, they would be a worse team. But that's something you have to think about if you're this Jazz team. Right now, the makeup of this team is Donovan Mitchell, Rudy Gobert, Bojan Bogdanovic, and then a lot of other role players that fit the makeup of the team. You have Mike Conley playing off of Donovan Mitchell. And yes, I'm calling Mike Conley a role player because that's what he is at this point. You have Jordan Clarkson off the bench. You have a team that fit kind of a concept that the Jazz had where you fit Donovan Mitchell with Rudy Gobert and then you put shooting around them to hopefully enhance everything they can do and what their talent is. And it didn't work out. The Jazz lose in the first round this year. And honestly, me personally, even though last season was probably one of the more least fun seasons as a Jazz fan, I still appreciate what the Jazz did. They had 2 all-star players. They tried to fit the best talent they possibly could around them, and they almost made it. Honestly, before last season, the year when they had the best record in the NBA, that was really probably the shot the Jazz had. It's just a shame that Donovan Mitchell and Mike Conley were injured. Otherwise, it might have been different. But that's spilt milk at this point. The Jazz have to think ahead. And the thing they need to think about doing at this point is being worse next year and most likely not making the playoffs. Why? Well, let's take a look. What I want to show you is if the goal for the Utah Jazz is to win a championship, I want to talk about what the most recent champions have done. And I'm just going to pull up a simple Wikipedia chart here that shows the most recent champions and really the champions of the last 20 years. And you're going to see a trend here. All right, so let's take a look here. The first one, who won the championship last year? This year we've got Golden State and Boston. Let's just talk about that for a second. Boston Celtics, what do they have? They have a team of elite 2-way role players. They have Jason Tatum, who's a top 5 player in the league right now, the way he's playing, and especially the last half of the season, he was remarkable. The Golden State Warriors, they have a multi-year MVP in Steph Curry. They have Draymond Green, Defensive Player of the Year candidate, and they have Klay Thompson and a bunch of other shooting. This is an interesting team because they're making a run with more of a collection of talent. But let's look at last year's championship team, Milwaukee Bucks. What did that team have? One, they had an MVP candidate in Giannis Antetokounmpo, who was the best player in the NBA this year. I don't think anyone would question that, or at least they wouldn't get mad at you for saying that. And then you have Chris Middleton and Drew Holiday on the Milwaukee Bucks. 2 elite 2-way players, and one of them an MVP candidate. The year before, you have the Los Angeles Lakers. You have LeBron James, MVP candidate. You had Anthony Davis in the bubble, who played just incredible elite 2-way play where he was a Defensive Player of the Year candidate on defense, and on offense he was hitting just insane amount of tough buckets in the playoffs. The year before, you have the Toronto Raptors. You have an MVP caliber player in Kawhi Leonard. You have elite 2-way players on that team, Pascal Siakam, Kyle Lowry. Are we seeing a trend here? The year before, you have the Golden State Warriors, MVP caliber player in Steph Curry, Kevin Durant. You have an elite Defensive Player of the Year candidate in Draymond Green. Same thing the year before. The year before, you have the Cleveland Cavaliers. You have LeBron James, MVP player with an elite scorer in Kyrie Irving. You have an elite talent at center in Kevin Durant. I think this actually is kind of an outlier. But the fact that you had the best player in the NBA in LeBron James is really the reason they win that title. and so on. And you can go back. So what is the trend here that we see with these teams? You have an MVP caliber player, if not the MVP, and then you have elite two-way players on the entire squad. Like you look at the Boston Celtics, you have guys that can defend at their position, at every position. Elite two-way guys. You have the defensive player of the year in Marcus Smart. You have just elite scoring. Al Horford at center, who's a high-level defender, but who can also score on the offensive end. Two-way player. Golden State Warriors as well. You've got MVP caliber player in Steph. You've got Klay Thompson, who's not quite what he was before. This is why I think that actually the Boston Celtics are going to win this series. But it's going to be interesting to watch. What do the Jazz have? The Jazz have two all-star players, but I would not say that the Jazz have two elite two-way players. The Jazz have an all-star in Donovan Mitchell, but he is not a good defensive player right now. He's just not. And you have Rudy Gobert, who's a defensive player of the year, so you've got some elements of a championship caliber team, and that's why the Jazz make it to the playoffs consistently. But Rudy Gobert is not an elite offensive player, and you see that in the playoffs when you can't get the ball to Rudy Gobert and he can get you a bucket when you need it. You know? You have to be a threat in the playoffs on both ends of the floor, and the Jazz just do not have that. Bojan Bogdanovic is a really elite offensive player. He is not a very good defensive player. He is not a two-way player. Royce O'Neal kind of fell off a cliff this year, but I guess he's the closest thing the Jazz have to a two-way player. He can shoot the three and defend on the other end, although I would argue he's not been very good defensively. It's rough. Jordan Clarkson is a nice offensive player, can't defend on the other end. The Jazz are so lopsided with each of their players, and what they need to do is have two-way players on the floor. But the fact of the matter is you can't even get to that point if you don't have an MVP caliber player on your team. And that is why the Jazz need to start thinking about moves for like a Gordon Hayward that you probably just move again, and you move off of Rudy Gobert because he's too good. He makes you too good to get elite level talent. And then you just try to hit in the draft. And like we've talked about, the Jazz, the only time they made it to the finals, what did they have? They had Karl Malone, MVP player, MVP of the league, John Stockton, elite two-way player, and then elite role players on both sides of the ball. But the thing that started it all was that you have an MVP in Karl Malone, an elite Hall of Fame player. You have John Stockton, elite two-way player. Not just an all-time leader in assists, but an all-time leader in steals, by the way. And that's why the Jazz were so good, and that's why they had that shot when they got Jeff Hornacek to go to the finals and win it all. It's what the Jazz need to do. And now, what are the Jazz going to do this upcoming offseason? They are going to, it looks like they're going to stick with, at minimum, Donovan Mitchell. And if they don't get a move that gets them at least what they're wanting for Rudy Gobert, they're not going to do it. But I would tell you right now, the Jazz need to start thinking about making a big-time move starting next year. If they get a big offer for Donovan Mitchell to get into the draft and take a swing at someone in the draft that they think can be the beginning of a nice team, then they need to do that. But here's the thing, is all these other teams that are in the draft have been trying to get that player. They are trying to get that top 3, top 4 pick. So you come out of it with an MVP caliber guy that you can build around to hopefully win a championship, because that's the goal, right? And the way you do that is you have to be proactive. You can't be reactive. If all the Jazz do is trade Rudy Gobert next year and keep Donovan Mitchell, yes, Donovan Mitchell's a really nice player, and if you come out of the draft with someone like Donovan Mitchell, that's great. But I personally don't see Donovan Mitchell as an MVP caliber guy, and that's why I would think about, if I'm the Jazz, just trading everyone, getting as many picks as they can, and go out and try to be bad so that if you get lucky enough, you can win that number 1 overall pick, something the Utah Jazz have never had. I mean, except if you consider the times when they traded that pick and it became Magic Johnson, and we all know how that worked out. Keep your draft picks and draft them. It's how you get those guys. It's how the Jazz got Karl Malone. How did they get Karl Malone? In the draft. How did they get John Stockton? In the draft. How did they get Darren Williams? In the draft. How did they get Donovan Mitchell, Rudy Gobert, Andre Kirilenko? How did they get all those guys? In the draft. And then they filled in the gaps when they had them. Carlos Boozer, Bojan Bogdanovic. You can't get the title if you don't get that player initially. You need the MVP guy. Giannis, LeBron, Kawhi Leonard. Those are the guys you need to build around. And once you have that guy and you have elite role players around them, all-star caliber guys, then you can go. Now, If you have any, let me know what you think in the comments. This is where I stand on it. That's why the Jazz need to think about doing it. If you haven't already, guys, like and subscribe to the channel. I will talk to you next time.